So the question that we're going to think about for a few moments this afternoon is whether the gospel records are credible, or to put it a slightly different way, can the four gospel accounts that we have on record as Matthew, Mark, Luke and John actually be trusted? Do they offer us a portrait or a set of portraits of him that are credible and understandable and that seem to stack up both to some of the internal evidence that we'll unpack together, but also some of the external evidence as well? There's lots of people who say that it can't be. This is from Dan. Who's read Dan Brown's book, The Da Vinci Code? Have my immense sympathy. It's turgid. And I forget the main character, but he says this: the Bible is a product of man, my dear, not of God. The Bible did not fall magically from the clouds. Man created it as a historical record of tumultuous times. It's evolved through countless translations, editions and revisions. History's never had a definitive version of the book, or so it claims within the novel. Now that's a novel. It's taken from one of the most famous novels in the last 20 years or so. But interestingly, of course, Richard Dawkins in his book The God Delusion kind of latches onto that and says, well, the only difference between the Da Vinci Code and the Gospels is that the Gospels are ancient fiction, whereas the Da Vinci Code is modern fiction. So whereas the first slide might have been one of those ones where we can simply punt to one side because it's in a book, or in a novel rather, actually that kind of idea has more than taken more than a significant hold on public imaginations. Or if the Gospels are credible, if they're reasonable, if the portraits that they have of the Lord Jesus are in any way, shape or form understandable, then we need to start asking some questions, and these are the ones I want to keep coming back to for the next half an hour or so. The first part is, well, what do they claim? What do the four Gospels say about Jesus, and can we actually get a handle on that in the first place? Because if we can't do that, then we're going to get stuck. The second one is whether they can be trusted. Third one is whether they can be tested. And the third one is whether they can be corroborated. So we're going to go through those four issues. What do they actually claim? Can they be trusted? Can they be tested? Can they be corroborated? And I'm going to keep coming back to this. I'm not sure what shape it is, but we're going to come back to that shape from time to time, just to remind you of those questions that we're starting with. Can they be tested? Can they be trusted? Can they be corroborated? Because if they can't, then we can put them on one side and walk out the door. If they can be, then we can begin to latch onto them. And if we use the normal standards that historians use to look at ancient source material, then is it reasonable to conclude that they do actually offer us a credible portrait about the one that they describe as Jesus of Nazareth? Now, there are two claims within the four Gospels, so two claims altogether within the four Gospel records of what the Gospels are trying to achieve. Anybody think about where they might be? One is in John. And we'll come to that in just a second. It's in John 20, yes. There's another one, and the other was in Luke 1. Thank you. So here's the first one. This is Luke chapter 1. It's saved us having an opening reading, you see, because we could just jump around it. So Luke makes his claim as his opening preface to his gospel, or the opening preface to part one of his two-part gospel, if you want to put it that way, because, of course, he's going to write Acts as well. And he says, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you might have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. That's the first, I think probably in terms of chronology of the Gospels being written as well, that's the first of the statements that makes a claim for what the Gospels are actually trying to do, or at least that's what Luke claims his Gospel is trying to do. He's passing on something to somebody he calls most excellent Theophilus, who's probably a high-ranking Roman, may well be a convert by the time we come to the book of Acts, where he's no longer called most excellent. But he's telling us these things, or he's telling Theophilus these things, in order that Theophilus might have certainty concerning the things that he's already been taught. So this is acting as a means to underline the things that have already been passed on to him verbally, and we'll come back to that idea in a minute. The other one, Andrew, you said was in John, and it's here at the end of John chapter 20, and you'll recognise this, because it's one of those verses that we very often turn to be able to explain what the gospel records are trying to achieve. Now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples which are not written in the book. John says, but the things that are written so that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Those are the claims that the Gospels make, in order that you might have certainty concerning the things that you've been taught, and in order that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. Now, you might be able to find other places within the Gospels where there are claims made for what's being said, but I think those are the two most obvious ones. And I think Luke's one is probably the most powerful of all, because John is already really telling us that his readers are believing that Jesus is the Christ. And you might say, well, they're already partly convinced then aren't they? But those are the claims that we've got. Now, if we were to ask what the four Gospels were all about, if I was to say you've got half a dozen words, you've got maybe less than a sentence to tell me what all four of the Gospels are about, that's quite a tall order to try to sum up each of the Gospels in 5 or 6 or 7 words. Anybody want to have a go at summing up what Matthew was about in half a dozen words? Incredibly difficult to do that, which is why I've got it coming up on the slide in a minute. But I just want to, anybody have a go at summing up what Matthew was about?
To show that Jesus is the King of Israel from the Old Testament.
Interesting. Okay, so Matthew's going to hang his gospel on an Old Testament peg then. Okay, it's very good. I like that. Not least because it's remarkably similar to what's going to appear in a minute. Anybody want to have a go at Mark? Mark is the hardest one actually, I think, because it's the one of all the four Gospels which seems to be, well, it's the shortest apart from anything else, seems to be trickiest to get a handle on. What's Mark all about?
Show that Jesus is the Son of God.
So Mark's Gospel is about, and that's how he begins, isn't it? This is the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it's written in the prophets, and he underpins it immediately with 2 Old Testament references. What about Luke? Best way to think about Luke is when you contrast it with Matthew, actually. Yes, I think that's fair, although that's often one that's tied up with Mark sometimes as well. Sometimes the easiest way to get a handle on what Luke is trying to say is by contrasting it with what Matthew is trying to say. If Matthew's gospel is a Jewish gospel, very much framed around that opening genealogy about Jesus being descended from David and Abraham, then Luke is the gospel that he says is the gospel to all the world. It's the gospel that's set in a Roman context, that it was in the days of Caesar Augustus that the census was made, or that the counting was done, and that Jesus is being set very firmly for us, not only certainly in a Jewish context, but more widely than that in a Roman world. I'll put that on the screen in just a second. Anybody want to have a go at John, which is the outlier, obviously, of the four? The harder one. Go on, Josie. Yeah, I think that's it. I think that's probably the easiest, not the easiest, but the most succinct way of doing it. This is a go, and it's incredibly difficult to get hold of this, but you've seen some of these things come out. This is often how Matthew, Mark, and Luke and John are summed up in their context. That Matthew, as we've been saying, hangs his gospel on a Jewish peg. Everything within Matthew is going to be set around the fact that you have to understand the Old Testament before you can go forwards. Mark, well, they all talk about Jesus' suffering, but people tend to look at Mark's gospel as being the one in which the Son of Man, interestingly, the servant, comes and is represented as being suffering. Luke, well, again, in contrast with Matthew, it's a gospel to the whole of the world rather than a gospel which is going to explain its Jewish underpinnings. And then John, as we were just saying, is perhaps best understood as Jesus as the Word made flesh. And interestingly, of course, the first 3 of those are very often spoken of as being from the bottom up. In other words, we get all the information about Jesus, but it's not clear until the very end that people are beginning to latch onto that. Whereas John works the other way around, and we get the information about Jesus as the Word made flesh right at the beginning, and then the rest of the Gospel is spent explaining what that's all about. Whereas the other 3 don't work like that; they go the other way around, and we get people struggling to figure out what's happening. Whereas in John, Jesus is explained right from the outset as being the manifestation of God. You may disagree with the way in which I've summed those up, and that's fine. It's incredibly difficult to do that in just a couple of words. But I think getting our heads around what the 4 Gospels are trying to achieve is quite interesting when we try to figure out whether or not they're reasonable and whether or not they're credible. So we've got little ways there, perhaps, of getting hold of what's happening there. And we see different perspectives. And the reason for getting it out like that, although one of them, 3 of them rather, have just greyed out, is that we're getting more than one angle on the same events. That some elements in one gospel are going to be brought to the front, and some elements in another gospel are going to be pushed to the back. And that's okay, because the different gospel writers have got slightly different aims in what they're trying to achieve, and that's fine. But we need to have that in our heads as we go through, I think, rather than just assuming that because one gospel writer has driven something harder than the other, that somehow they're sitting at odds with each other, and I don't think they are. But we're just recognising perhaps why they are, I'm not going to say contradictions, but why there are different emphases within those records. So we're dropping into a time of a non-digital culture, dropping into a time when oral tradition is king, when Jewish scribes could memorise whole chapters, whole books, whole sections of their scriptures, because that was how it worked, and that was how information was initially passed on. First century Judaism in particular was an oral culture where things were passed on from mouth to mouth rather than anything else. We're entering a time when, well, we're looking, I suppose you could say, at 4 ancient biographies. Now, biographies from the ancient world were very different from the biographies that you would pick up if you walked into Waterstones today. Deb bought me Shane Warne's autobiography a few months ago, and it's about yay thick, and it's really rather exciting, but it contains an awful lot of material about Shane Warne's early drinking years, which is probably less interesting, and then it gets on to how he managed to bowl his magic ball to Mike Gatting in 1993, and the cricket that I guess most people have bought the book for in the first place. In other words, modern biographies or autobiographies cover everything, warts and all, and one of the appeals for those is that you're getting under the skin of the person that you're actually reading about. And if you've read any old autobiographies in the last few years, you'll understand why I'm saying it like that. An ancient world biography didn't happen like that. They aimed only on the key events of that person's life, which is why, for example, Luke chapter 9 begins the last 6 months of Jesus' ministry, and the remaining, 15 chapters will focus on the last 6 months of his ministry and his life, whereas the first 9 and a bit chapters have really only focused on, well, a little bit right at the beginning, and then 30 years of nothing, and then 3 years of the ministry. So the focus in these ancient biographies is very different from the ones that we would see if we picked up just any random book from the autobiography section in a bookshop today. We're also getting into a time about how groups leave their legacy. Experts say that there's 3 kinds of memory. There's an individual memory. So you remember where you were standing when something significant happened. My dad always tells me that he remembers that he was stacking shelves in the supermarket at the moment when England won the World Cup in 1966, and I think he resents it even now. But he remembers, and that's what he remembers about that particular day. We all have individual things locked away in our heads that occasionally float back to the surface that we hold on to. Second kind of memory is a social memory that groups have as a whole. So we might here remember individual people or individual events that took place within the ecclesia. You might remember that certain key family events. I'm thinking of Hardy get-togethers, but key things. I remember that Christmas when my Uncle Malcolm's false teeth fell out in the gravy. That kind of thing. As a family, you share that memory, and it's quite entertaining. But you hold it together, and everybody within that group knows something about it. And then there's a corporate legacy, a cultural legacy or memory that overall nations tend to build together. And I guess last year's armistice is as good an example of anything, where an entire, I can say an entire nation, an entire culture almost, remembered something specific. So it began to grow up over time. But it's the middle one of those two that I think is the most significant here. It's about how groups together begin to form an accurate memory of what they know has happened. And that's incredibly significant when it comes to the way in which the 4 Gospels work, because it's the nature of these 4 ancient biographies that begin to tell us about the credibility of the Gospels that we've got. And you think about how you read stories to your children or your grandchildren, that if you read something out and you miss out a word, thinking of the 5-year-old in there, you get glared at because they know exactly what's coming next and you've missed it out, so you have to go back and fill it in again because you get glared at otherwise, and it's true, right? So that's the way in which this worked in the first century, was that the records of Jesus begin to be compiled, and as they are, there's almost a self-editing process that takes place throughout that process. Think of, if I lower the tone for a minute, different angles for video replay. Anybody recognise what that match that only took place a few weeks ago?
Like Liverpool and Manchester City.
Thank you. You win a bun. So this was, Andrew's like my new superhero, because I get this talk at Castleford and they all look blank. So there's clearly the wrong sports to have taken to Castleford apart from anything else, but there we are. So this was the moment when the title race was potentially about to turn on its head, and Mo Salah was about to sort of run through the defender and get the ball in the back of the net when it was still 0-0 between Manchester City and Liverpool a few weeks ago. And if you look at it from a slightly different angle, it appears that he did, and that it should have been 1-0 to Liverpool, he says rather bitterly. But the video replay said that 11% of the ball hadn't crossed the line, and therefore it wasn't a goal, and therefore it was quite rightly, I'm still quite bitter about this, aren't I? The significance of it being that all three of those camera angles you saw were completely accurate. But it's only when you put them all together that you get that reaction and that result, and you can figure out whether or not it was a goal or not. My wife thinks I'm talking complete nonsense, but I think it's significant because this is one of the reasons that we've got 4 Gospels instead of one long running account. Because we can look at things from more than one perspective, and they add additional credibility as you go through the process, rather than simply having one person talking about one thing that they remember on one particular day and it having no checks and balances throughout. And it also tells us, I guess, if you think about it, why the Gospels are not word for word verbatim alike. It's one of the great lines which the skeptics use against the Gospels. Why is it that Jesus appears to use different words when talking to the same people, depending on which Gospel record you look at? And that's because different perspectives are entirely credible. Think, for example, about when you ask a couple about their first kiss. Now, if I was to tell you with my wife in a different room about the time when I first kissed my wife, I will tell you it was something like Handel's Messiah playing in the background. That there were harps and trumpets playing, that the heavens resounded with a mighty sound, and if you ask her, she'll tell you that it was on a slightly scruffy piece of recreational ground just outside Weekley Lane in northeast Kettering, and that I was struck by stage fright and stepped back into a pile of dog unmentionable on the floor, and barely spoke again for another week. And if you take out the slight artistic license in my version of the story, both of those records are true. But when you talk to people, you get very different emphases.
I think it's clear to say which of us are
The emphasis is more significant, I think, was the Handel one. Think if you've been to a funeral and you hear more than one person talking about the person who's died. Because you very often come away thinking, well, I never knew that about them. I never knew about their working life because I've only ever seen them at the weekend, for example, or vice versa. Get very different perspectives talking about who you know. Military accounts is a classic example of this. Army officers and army chaplains see the very same battle in incredibly different ways because they're used to seeing things differently. They experience events differently, even though the exact same things took place, because what they're expecting to see and what they remember and record are profoundly different things. So it comes back to this issue again. There's my weird shape in the corner of the screen. Can it be tested? Can it be trusted? Can it be corroborated? It matters that these things are credible, but it also matters that these things sit side by side. Doesn't mean that they're not biased as accounts, and I think that's really significant, because having a bias doesn't make you an unreliable witness. Now, there's an awful lot of noise going on at the moment in the US with the Russia investigation into Donald Trump, and he is saying that the investigation can't be trusted because they're all Democrats and they're all out to get him and it's a witch hunt. Now, firstly, they're not all Democrats. In fact, hardly any of them are. But even if they were, it wouldn't render their investigation biased and therefore unreliable by default, because everybody has a bias. You just need to know what it is. And when you know what it is, you can play off it and work out a line of best fit that runs from that. So having a bias doesn't make you an unreliable witness. What it means is you just need to know what that bias is, so that your testimony can be underlined as being credible or not. And that goes to the heart of whether these things are credible in the first place. So we're thinking about these 4 gospel accounts and the significance of them being more than one. We'll contrast that, if you will, with the other world religions' holy books. Because when you begin to put these on a screen, you realise how significant the New Testament is simply by having those 4 accounts. Buddhism has got a whole series of different sutras which are aimed at different audiences. So there's a group of teachings which are aimed at potential converts. There's a group of teachings which are aimed at the monastic community. There's a group of teachings which are aimed at a more scholarly community, all of which are given equal credence within the eyes of the faith, with the Buddhist faith, but none of which have got this same example that we've been thinking of parallel accounts of one individual's life from more than one perspective. So you can take or leave Buddhism based on whatever feelings you may have, but you can't look at it in the same way that you look at the New Testament Gospels and say, well, there's a similar example happening in the Buddhist scriptures. The same could be said for Islam. think of the Quran, or think of the Hadith, which is the second most holy book, the teachings of Muhammad's closest family. And again, you can take or leave the records, but there are no parallel accounts of one person's life from more than one perspective. It's the same for the Hindu writings. The Mahabharata's got 1.8 million words. It's a massive epic that runs across several centuries, and has been continually added to over hundreds and hundreds of years. And whether or not you choose to do anything with the records that it has, with the teachings within it, there is no example within the Hindu writings of 1, 2, 3, 4 accounts of one person's life written from more than one particular angle. Same could be said of the Baha'i faith. Same could also be said for the Sikh writings, which were first put together in 1604 and then re-edited and republished in 1705. There are stories of satire, there are stories of poetry, there are historical writings within it, but nowhere is a set of parallel accounts of one individual's life running alongside each other. Same is true for the Taoist writings, put together right back in the 6th century BC in China. You won't find these 4 parallel, or even 2 or 3 parallel accounts running alongside. Interestingly, it's only when you come to Judaism when we can start just to open the lid on this, because even within what we would perhaps call the Old Testament, but what the Jews would call their scriptures, you don't have these parallel accounts, but it is slightly closer to what we're thinking about, because you have 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and you have the prophets who refer back to what's happening within those historical narrative accounts. So it's not exactly the same. But if of all of those 7 examples on the screen, Judaism is the closest perhaps to what we've actually been thinking about here. And all of that is significant because Christianity depends on one person. Depends on one individual living the life that the Gospels tell us he lived in a particular place, rooted in a specific historical context, in a Greco-Roman world, saying what he said, interacting with the people he interacted with, going to the towns and cities that he went to, all of which can be cross-referenced, as we'll see as we go on for the next 5 or 10 minutes or so. And none of the writings of all of the other world faiths which are up there, as I say, with the potential exception of Judaism, and you can understand why I'm drawing that parallel, can be seen of in the same way. It needs a real person in a real cultural framework, in a real life situation, to be able to understand what we're getting at here. But to do that, I guess you need to be able to trust them, and you need to be able to see whether or not they're credible. So it just allows us to move on to ask the next question, which is how good are the eyewitness accounts that we've got? Because if they are strong, then we can begin to trust them a little bit more. Because for the New Testament, mythology is often an issue. There are people who say, well, we don't doubt that Jesus was a historical figure, but we think that the miracles were added in later. We think that the things which were special about him, and which Christians look at and say, well, this is clearly out of the ordinary, are the things which were added in after the events took place and before the records about him were actually written down. And we can just begin to chase that back. And I remember doing this with you a couple of years ago, so I'll see whether your memory's good. We've thought about Luke's first book that he wrote. Let's think about Luke's second book that he wrote. What happens at the end of the book of Acts? How does the book of Acts finish? Yeah, Acts 28 finishes up with Paul in his own hired house in Rome. He's been taken under guard. There's the shipwreck in chapter 27, and chapter 28 he comes to Rome. There's almost a triumphal procession as he arrives in Rome, and then he's there in his own hired house. Now there's pretty good external evidence to say that Paul is martyred for his faith in Rome in the middle of the 60s AD. And I remember making this point before, that the question we have to ask is, if when Luke is writing Acts, Paul has died, don't you think that Luke would have finished off the book of Acts by telling us that Paul has died? In other words, the fact that Acts ends with Paul preaching in his own hired house leads us to suggest that when Acts is written, Paul is still alive. Because the balance of probability says that if Paul was dead when Acts is being written, Luke would have told us about it, because it would be a pretty significant part of the story for him to have accidentally forgotten to drop in. In other words, Acts therefore has to be written, almost certainly has to be written, prior to Paul dying. Now, one of the traditional dates for Acts is about AD 63. You can't see that on the screen. My screen works perfectly. You just see why this is not working. There we are. That's because I haven't pressed the button. There you go. You can put Acts at about AD 63, and you can push that number 1 or 2 years in either direction, and it doesn't really matter. We've also been saying, of course, and there's the ministry of Jesus just for comparison. We've also been saying that Acts is not the first thing that Luke writes. Luke is the first thing that Luke writes. So if you wanted, you would struggle to make Luke any later than AD 62. I know Andrew's got a different take on this, and we'll talk about that afterwards. I'm going for the most extreme perspective here. And the balance of evidence says that Mark is written ahead of Luke, and I'm not looking at you during this point, but I go with what I have on the screen. That what happens is that Mark comes first, and that Luke comes along probably around the same time as Matthew, and Acts obviously has to come after that. And interestingly, of course, even if those dates can be pushed 5 years or so in either direction, what you've got is a very small window for things to take place and to be mythologized, which is a word I need to say with my teeth properly secure, between the ministry of Jesus in round about AD 30 and the records which are written down no later than the 60s AD. And that's significant because what we're asking is, are the records credible? Do they contain things that we can believe, even though they seem incredibly out there in terms of our common understanding of how things work? Or is it the case that if the eyewitness accounts of these are so close to the events that actually took place, then we've got very little reason to believe that people are beginning to make it up, particularly when we're in this world of social memory, when people are looking at this, just like the children when they're listening to a book being read and saying, hang on a minute, you've got that wrong. You can't say that, because what we're trying to do here is to preach a record of truth and love and good works and veracity, and you can't just add something in that's not true, because it will begin to paint a different picture of what Jesus is trying to appeal. So we can ask the same question as we've been asking before. Can it be tested, and can it be trusted? Can it be corroborated? Is it reasonable to believe that that very short time space there is not enough time for myths and legends, if we can call them that, to begin to grow up? It's interesting, actually, when Holocaust survivors begin to go to die, to leave the scene in their 50s and 60s and 70s, that was the point at which the great museums and libraries of the world began to record their testimony, so that the events which took place under the Nazis in the 1940s wouldn't be lost to history. And it's round about this point, when people are in their 50s and 60s and 70s who have seen the ministry of Jesus 30 or so years earlier, that's when these are certainly written down. As I say, you can make cases for that being a lot earlier on, but no later than the early 60s AD. That, I think, is significant. Let me introduce you to somebody else. A man named Papias. He was an elder in Hierapolis, not far from Colossae. And the writings of Papias are, of all the things which have not survived from the ancient world, they are the things that historians would give their left arms and legs to dig out of the sand of ancient Egypt, because they're the things that people want to use to understand what the early Gospels actually contained, or what the world of the first century Christians may have contained. And the only bits that we've got left of the writings of Papias have been copied out by other people prior to his stuff being lost, and have been transmitted down to us in other writings. And the most voluminous set of, well, you might be able to make out the word that's on the screen there, they're called the Fragments of Papias, which is not the most compelling of titles, are recorded in Eusebius' Ecclesiastical History. Now, Eusebius thought that Papias was mad. He thought he was absolutely stir-fry crazy because Papias believed in the millennial reign of Christ. I shall leave that fact hanging in the air for a few seconds for you to ponder. Eusebius thought that Papias was crazy because he believed in the millennial reign of the Lord Jesus Christ. And he wrote down several of his writings before, obviously, the originals disappeared and were lost in the mists of time, in order to disprove him. And we can just capture one or two of the things which he said. And this is the first. I shall not hesitate to put into properly ordered form for you everything I learned carefully in the past from the elders, and note down well, for the truth of which I vouch. So you might recognise that's remarkably similar to the passage that we looked at right back in Luke chapter 1, where Luke is laying out why he's written his gospel. Papias is telling us almost the same sort of stuff, that I learned in the past from the elders, and I've written them down, and I vouch for the truth of what I've done, and I've written them out in this carefully ordered way for you. And he also went on to say these: Mark, the interpreter of Peter, come back to that fact in a second, wrote down carefully what he remembered, both the sayings and the deeds of Christ. He made no mistake in writing the individual discourses in the order in which he recalled them. His one concern was not to omit a single thing he had heard, or to leave out any untruth in this account. And he also goes on to say that Matthew composed the discourses in Hebrew, and everyone interpreted them to the best of his ability. That's interesting, given we've been talking about Matthew's gospel having a Jewish framework. We won't get too much into that for now. But what that means is that Papias is telling us that Mark's gospel, which, as I say, some people think is the first of the four gospels that need to be written down, has been given to Mark by Peter, by one of the primary apostles. And as a result of that, Mark wrote down carefully what he remembered, the sayings and the deeds of Christ, and didn't make any mistakes when he was writing them down. In other words, the record of Mark's gospel, so says this fragment up here, can be very closely tied to one of the apostles who spent Jesus' entire ministry with him. Not to somebody who came along 50 years later or 75 years later and said, well, I wonder what we can write down about this guy we've heard so much about. But somebody who was right there at the time, walking around with Jesus of Nazareth and seeing exactly what he did. In other words, that little red arrow that we had on the screen a couple of moments ago makes a lot more sense now, because early dating of the accounts that the gospel writers have matters a lot. It means that they're first-hand accounts written within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. As Chinese whispered on down through several generations before somebody finally starts writing stuff down, because the closer the date, the more accurate the record. It's a standard of historical interpretation. The closer you get to the events which are actually being talked about, the more likely it is that these things are true. There's no time for myths to develop. People have actually studied this and said that it generally takes 3 generations for a myth to develop about a particular individual. There's just not enough time here in this 35 year window that we've been saying is the absolute maximum for the records to be translated, for these things actually to develop. And significantly, I think about a conversation we had on New Year's Day at Ken and Linda's house when we went for our walk, there's far less possibility of the Gospels having been put together from a common source document and people just copy out the bits that they're interested in. Because the fact is that the Gospel writers themselves are taking evidence or taking accounts from things that they've seen incredibly closely. This is not about whether you can chuck it into a test tube, boil off all of the water and be left just with its trace elements. This is about saying, is it reasonable to conclude that the Gospels are as credible as they say they have to be? Do they actually meet key historical standards as we're working our way through this? You can contrast this actually with the Suetonius' account of Tiberius Caesar, because there's a great myth-like saint's life that develops of Tiberius Caesar, who of course is one of the significant rulers from Rome. And it's about 80 years after the death of Tiberius Caesar before Suetonius writes anything about him. And in that 80-year period, there's absolutely nothing. There is just a great big black hole of nothing between Tiberius Caesar dying and Suetonius actually writing something down. Whereas the 80 years, if you like, between the end of Jesus' life in about AD 30 and, well, I'm adding numbers in my head, after Revelation is written at AD 110, you've got hundreds of thousands, or certainly tens of thousands of people being baptized, of messages beginning to circulate around the Eastern Mediterranean. You've got an entire cottage industry of writing developing around Jesus of Nazareth, in contrast with this absolute nothing that takes place for somebody else. In other words, the chances of that having happened without these things being right back at the start of the process is almost non-existent. And we've got, and I'm not going to get into this because it gets even more dry and dusty than we've done already, there are 4 separate stacks of historical evidence from the 2nd century that tell us about when the 4 Gospels are beginning to be put together. So there's a harmony of 4 Gospels about maybe 1.5 generations after Revelation is written. There's a list of 4 Gospels within a list of the canonical books of the New Testament by about AD 180. Irenaeus is writing that Matthew, Mark, Luke and John are part of the Bible by about AD 180 as well. And then there's a papyrus like papyruses, you can tell from the first picture. There's actually a codex with all 4 of the Gospels bound together by about AD 200. There's also the Magdalen College one as well, but there's so much scepticism about the dating for that. I'm just leaving that on one side for now. But there are those 4 which are fairly copper bottom, I think, in terms of the way in which the evidence works. So it comes back to this issue again of, can it be tested? Can it be trusted? Can it be corroborated? Is it reasonable to start thinking that the Gospels are what they say they are? Because more than any other historical work of antiquity, you can begin to lay evidence at the feet of the Gospels that makes sense. Were they writers of integrity? Because if they're not, then they're nothing more than charlatans, and again we can start to put their work on one side. If they are writers of integrity, then again I think we've got less reason to start questioning them. The Gospel writers talk about Roman politics, they talk about geography, they talk about topography, they talk about Jewish religious culture, they talk about stuff that we can understand from that period based on other writings. They talk about places that you can find when you walk around the Holy Land now, and you can begin to understand where they are because the Gospel writers have spoken about them. Luke, for one, accurately names, in both Luke and Acts put together, 32 provinces, 54 cities, sorry that red's not coming out very well, and 9 islands, and he accurately describes government officials and proconsuls and tetrarchs using the language that people would have used at the time. And in fact, F.F. Bruce says, a man whose accuracy can be demonstrated in matters where we can test it is likely to be accurate even when the means for testing him are not available. In other words, because he's true where we can figure it out, he may well be true also in the places that we can't. Luke's record entitles him to be regarded as a man of habitual accuracy. Can it be tested? Can it be trusted? Can it be corroborated? It matters. It matters because we can begin to get rid of the reasons not to believe the Gospels. And it also just allows us to think about how they've been named. Now, when we had that thing on the screen a minute or so ago from Papias, who said that Mark had been the interpreter of Peter, in other words, Papias tells us round about 100 AD or thereabouts, depending on when you date him, that Mark takes his advice from Peter and that Luke takes his advice from Paul. Now let's just take the first one of those two for a minute, because it's probably easier to do it that way round. Who would you choose as the author of Mark? If you were, this position I don't think ever existed, if you were the New Testament editor-in-chief, and you were putting names at the top of the 4 Gospels, and you wanted them to be as credible as possible in the eyes of people who might read them and go, I'm not sure that kind of stuff makes sense, who would you choose of those 2 individuals on the screen? Would you choose John Mark, or would you choose Peter? What do we know about John Mark?
You choose Peter because John Mark was a nobody.
That's the point. You would choose the preeminent apostle, probably of the 12, who is arguably one of the most significant people after Jesus in the Gospels altogether, who we know lots and lots about, and whose preaching record in the book of Acts is second to none, over John Mark, who gets sent home from one of the missionary journeys for, I would say misbehaviour, that's not the right phrase to use at all, but certainly because Paul wasn't impressed with him, right? Now he comes back to the fold, but you would choose Peter. And interestingly, the Gospels don't do that. They don't say we're going to pick the guy that is clearly the headline news. We're going to pick the person who all the evidence seems to suggest actually wrote it, because accuracy is more important than the headline. Accuracy is more important than a quick win that you can claim in order to very quickly gather more people together because, well, Peter's written it and therefore everything should be believed. That's really important, I think, in the way in which we understand the Gospels. Because what they're trying to do is to be as accurate as possible and as honest as possible, even though it means that they, in some ways, and this is the irony of it, you almost have to be incredible in order to be more credible. And that's important. There's no evidence of legends being created. And in fact, when you think about what's in the Gospels, the Gospel writers themselves, in many ways, don't come off very well. So they include facts that you can check, which you wouldn't do if you were trying to fabricate something. They show the disciples to come off not particularly well. They come out hard-hearted, they come out cowardly, in some ways they come out really rather clueless, which perhaps goes back to the Peter issue. They had nothing to gain at all from being unpopular. They're not chasing short-term wins in what's going on here. And none of the writers ever renounce their faith even in the face of death. So there may well be a gap between the events which are written down and the records which contain them, but there's always a gap. If you had a photo of Moses coming down the mountain with the tables of stone in his hands, you would always say, well, what happened before he came round the corner? So there's always a gap of some kind. It's whether we've got the sense in which nothing changes from the very first record we've got up until now. So because nothing's changed there, is it reasonable to assume that just before the first record we've got, everything was higgledy-piggledy and you can't trust it at all? Well, of course not. What you do is you say, based on 2,000 years of stability, it makes no sense whatsoever for the gospel suddenly to have come out of absolutely nowhere. And Peter Williams, who's principal of Tyndale House, gave a talk in the States a couple of weeks ago, and he said, it's interesting that people nowadays have more doubts about the text of the New Testament than they've ever had, and yet the gap between our earliest New Testament manuscripts and the time of writing is getting smaller and smaller. So in other words, the amount of doubt is inversely proportionate to the amount of evidence. And I'll leave you just to ponder that for a minute, because I think that in itself is significant. Can it be tested? Can it be trusted? Can it be corroborated? That matters. Begins to take away any possibility of there being reasons that the records here don't make sense. Now, time's ticking on. Last point just to make for a moment, because I keep talking about corroboration. We haven't really talked about corroborating evidence. You will know, I think, as much as me, that much of the evidence of Jesus' life is found in the Gospels, but a number of the key facts about him can be gleaned from what people often describe as hostile witnesses. In other words, from the records of high-ranking officials or historians or philosophers who wrote down things about this emerging faith called Christianity, but who themselves didn't believe it. And they told us things about Jesus which just allow us to put together a bigger picture of who he was. So they tell us, and you can amalgamate all of these together, they tell us about a Jew who lived in the first third of the first century. They tell us that he was born out of wedlock. They tell us that he was a self-styled teacher who became very popular. They tell us that he selected certain men as his inner core of disciples. They tell us that he disregarded Jewish dietary laws and ate with those who were despised. They tell us that he enraged certain Jewish leaders. They tell us that he was believed to be the Messiah by others. They tell us he was crucified by Pontius Pilate, and they tell us that his followers who began a fledgling religion that never died out. Those are people who don't believe in Jesus of Nazareth as the Christ. And yet, all of the things that we've got on the screen there are obviously corroborating the bigger picture that the four Gospels give us. You don't get that in any of the holy books. It just isn't there, because they're not telling us about one individual who lived and died 2,000 years ago and who met with the people that we know he met with, and who went to the places we know he went to, and who left on record for us the truth that we should love the Lord God with all our heart and mind and soul and strength, and love our neighbour as ourselves. Can it be tested? Can it be trusted? Can it be corroborated? This was where we started, with these four questions about what are the Gospels about, and can we actually unpack their claims? Does it actually make sense that we've got it there? Well, the Gospels tell us, fairly obviously, that Jesus rose from the dead and preached repentance of sins. We've also figured out, if we didn't know it already, that the authors are credible first-generation eyewitnesses. In other words, the gap between the events which are there and the records which that they're talking about, the records which contain them, are barely more than a handful of years. We've talked about the fact that bias isn't an issue, provided you know what it is, and that the things that we've got on record for us have been accurately transmitted so far as anything is reasonable when we're looking at these things. And we've also just at the end there thought about non-Christian sources confirming many key elements. Now that's huge, because it means that the faith that we have, things that we believe concerning the kingdom of God in the name of Jesus Christ, are based not on supposition, they're based not on philosophy, they're based not on somebody just sticking a finger in the wind and saying, well, I wonder what I'll believe today, but they're based on truth. And because they're based on truth, and because we therefore can work out from what we have in the Gospels that the Lord is going to send his Son again, that the King will again be in the earth, that those who sleep in the dust will be raised again, and that all will join together to unite with him throughout eternity, can be certain of it because what we've got there on record for us. So I guess we just go out and we live now as if the kingdom will be here tomorrow.